Dawn crept slowly over the Medicine Bow Mountains, turning the jagged ridges from charcoal to muted gold. The air still held the sharp, earthy bite of nighttime cold, and wisps of silver fog drifted low across the pasture like ghosts reluctant to leave. Every fence post, every pine needle, every blade of frozen grass glimmered with dew, as if the whole land was waking from a long, uneasy dream. Clara was already in the corral when the first shaft of sunlight spilled over the treetops. She moved with a quiet confidence, light-footed, steady, unhurried. The horses stirred at her presence, ears swiveling, breaths puffing in soft white clouds. She didn't speak to them. Not in words, anyway. She simply reached out, palm open, fingers relaxed, as if offering trust itself. And somehow, the animals responded. At 20, Clara carried the look of someone far older, someone shaped by hardship, sharpened by miles, traveled on foot in the silence of too many lonely nights. Her skin held a warm, sun-burnished tone. Her long black hair, braided and tied with a thin strip of deerskin, brushed her shoulders as she worked. Years ago, she had come north with a migrating Apache group, only to lose her family in a brutal winter storm that scattered them across the plains. A widow in Laramie had taken her in for a short while, and eventually Clara found her way here, to Double B Ranch at just 16, thin, bruised by travel, but unbroken. Double B had become her world, or at least the closest thing she had to one. She brushed down a bay mare now, humming under her breath, a tone soft enough to melt tension, strong enough to hold a restless animal steady. The mare lowered her head, leaning into Clara's touch as if comforted by a force older than the land itself. Half a field away, Thomas Brennan reined in his horse and watched. He'd been out checking the northern fence line since before sunrise, the way he did most mornings. Habits taught by a father who believed a rancher only slept when the cattle did. Thomas was built like a man sculpted by hard labor, broad-shouldered, long-limbed, lean from saddle hours and winters that didn't show mercy. At 28, he was the only son of Marcus Brennan, and though he carried the family name with the expected pride, he wore the title of heir like an ill-fitting coat, heavy, stiff, suffocating. Most men admired Thomas for his grit. Some feared him for his bluntness, but only a few noticed the quieter truth beneath all that. He longed for a life shaped by his own choices, not the steel-edged expectations of the Double B legacy. And this morning, that truth sharpened when he caught sight of Clara. He watched her from the saddle, the way she laid a hand on the mare's neck, the way the animal's tense muscles softened beneath her touch. There was something about her calmness, a rare kind of stillness found only in people who'd endured storms and learned not to break. The ranch was loud, demanding, relentless, but she brought a different kind of rhythm to it, steady, grounded, uncomplicated. Thomas nudged his horse closer, pretending he needed to check on the corral, though he knew exactly why he was riding in this direction. A young stallion, black as spilled ink and temperamental as wildfire, pawed the dirt and swung his hindquarters toward Thomas the moment he dismounted. The animal's ears flattened, its nostrils flared. One wrong move and it would kick. "Careful," Clara said quietly, her voice low. Not commanding, not frightened, just aware. Thomas barely had time to react before the stallion lashed out, powerful hooves slicing the air. He jerked back, boots scraping dust. The horse snorted, muscles coiled, ready to strike again. But Clara stepped forward. Just one step. She didn't grab a rope. She didn't raise her voice. She simply placed her hand against the stallion's neck. Light as a whisper, firm as stone. The animal froze. Its breathing slowed, its head lowered by inches, then more, until the fury drained from its posture, the way heat leaves the air at sunset. Thomas exhaled, unaware he had been holding his breath. Clara glanced at him, expression unreadable, though her dark eyes held a depth he had never been able to ignore. "He's just scared," she said softly. "Yeah," Thomas answered, his voice a little rough. "I guess we all are." He hadn't meant for the words to slip out, but Clara heard them, really heard them. It showed in the brief flicker of her gaze, a look that lingered a heartbeat too long. And right there, in the hush of dawn with horses settling behind them, something began. Not with a word, not with a touch, but with a look, steady, searching, unguarded. The kind of look that changes the course of a life. The sun had climbed fully over the Medicine Bow Range by the time Thomas rode back toward the heart of Double B Ranch. And as he passed through the main valley, the sheer size of the place stretched out before him with its usual quiet authority. The land wasn't gentle, nor was it forgiving. It was made of red earth, packed hard by hooves and heat, of sagebrush that hissed when the wind struck it, of dust devils twisting like restless spirits across the open plain. Black Angus cattle dotted the vast fields, slow-moving, broad-shouldered shadows against the copper-colored ground. Through all of it, the relentless Wyoming wind swept across the landscape like a keeper, carrying the keys to some wild, untamed kingdom. To Marcus Brennan, it was a kingdom, one carved from sweat, stubbornness, and more than a few dangerous seasons. He'd come to this land when it was still little more than rugged slopes and rattlesnake whispers, and he'd built it up inch by blistering inch. Now that the place sprawled over more acres than a man could count in a single sunrise, Marcus carried a fierce, almost possessive pride for every fence post and every herd that grazed beneath his brand. That pride was exactly why he sat stiff-backed at the big oak table in the ranch house when Thomas walked in, papers spread in front of him like maps of a battlefield. Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't slam a fist, didn't gesture wildly. He never needed theatrics. His authority lay in the way he stared at a man, unblinking, assessing, a little too sharp, until he got the answer he wanted. "There's talk," Marcus said without looking up, "that the Whitmans are open to an arrangement, a smart match. Their land sits right up against our south pasture. A marriage could close that gap permanently." Thomas paused near the doorway, jaw tight. He wasn't surprised. Rumors had been swirling for months that his father had begun scouting alliances. But hearing it spoken aloud, crisp and cold as morning frost, still hit him like a thrown horseshoe. "I'm not marrying someone because of a fence line," Thomas replied, his voice low but edged. "This isn't the way things should work." Marcus finally raised his head. His eyes were the same storm-dark shade as Thomas's, but without the softer undertones Thomas carried. No hope, no hesitation, just granite certainty. "This ranch didn't grow on wishes or feelings. It grew because I made choices that were good for the land. You'll do the same. The Brennans stay strong by binding with the right families. That's how men survive out here." Thomas's hands curled into fists at his sides. He'd faced rustlers, broken Mustangs, winter blizzards that could kill a man before sundown. But none of it felt as suffocating as the way his father boxed his future into a tidy, loveless deal. He could picture it too easily. A crisp handshake with some wealthy patriarch, a wedding he had no say in, a life spent honoring agreements instead of his own heart. It tasted like dust in his mouth. "I can run this ranch without marrying into someone else's," Thomas muttered. "I'm not a bargaining chip." Marcus didn't flinch. "You're my son, and this ranch needs more than hard work to stay alive. It needs connections, money, strength. Marriage brings those things whether you like it or not." The conversation ended the way so many between them did, in silence that felt heavier than spoken threats. Thomas stepped outside again, sucking in the crisp Wyoming air as if it were the only thing that could keep the frustration from choking him. From where he stood, he could see Clara across the yard, tending to a young gelding whose legs she was wrapping with slow, practiced care. Her braid fell over her shoulder, sunlight glinting on the small beads woven into it. She looked peaceful, focused, untouched by the storm brewing inside the ranch house walls. To her, Double B was simply a place where she earned her keep, found safety, and tried, every day, to learn how to breathe again after losing everyone she once loved. Clara had no idea she was standing on the outer edge of a brewing war. She didn't know that families from every corner of Wyoming were quietly assessing the Brennans like hungry wolves. She didn't know that her name had already appeared in whispers that carried through the workforce. Soft warnings about where the heir's eyes wandered lately. All she knew was the gelding's trembling leg beneath her hands, the rugged smell of dust and horsehair, and the steady rhythm of her breath. Thomas watched her for a long moment, the tension in his chest knotting tighter. She didn't know she was already tangled in his father's plans, simply by existing in this place. She didn't know her calm presence was the only thing that made this land feel tolerable to him. She had no idea that a storm was coming, and she had no idea that she was standing right in its path. The following week unfolded like the tightening of a noose, each day drawing the ranch closer to something heavy and unavoidable. Word shimmered across Wyoming faster than dust on a dry wind. Marcus Brennan was opening Double B to visitors. Not just any visitors, but the 5 wealthiest families west of the Missouri. Folks in town whispered about it with the hushed excitement of gamblers smelling fresh steaks. Ranch hands grumbled into their coffee mugs, and the ranch house kitchen buzzed like a hive preparing for a queen. By the time the first carriage crested the ridge road, the ranch had already been stripped of its usual wild stillness. Fresh paint shined on the porch rails, the long dining table was stretched with new linens, and Marcus's prized stallions had been groomed until their coats gleamed like polished obsidian. The families arrived the way storms roll in, one after another, noisy and impossible to ignore. The Prescotts came first, stepping out of their glossy black carriage with the air of people accustomed to vaults full of money they didn't need to count. Their daughter, Margaret, wore a pale green silk dress that shimmered like snake scales in the sun. She held her chin high, her eyes sharp and appraising, the kind of girl who measured a man not by character, but by what kind of empire stood behind his last name. Then came the Whitmans, horse and land barons whose wealth was built not in banks but in acres. Sarah Whitman walked beside her parents, boots dusted from travel, her dress simpler, sturdier, and more functional than the other girls. There was nothing fragile about her. She carried herself like someone who knew how to wrangle a colt or shoot down a rumor before it got legs. The Harrison family rolled in on the smooth tracks of railroad money, their polished luggage stacked high, their daughter Elizabeth peeking shyly from behind her mother, her face half hidden by a parasol. She seemed soft, almost too soft for a place where wind cut across the land like a cold blade. The Carmichaels brought politics in their wake, along with their daughter Patricia, a tall brunette with a face carved into something elegant and calculating. She stepped onto Brennan's soil like she was stepping into a negotiation where she had already chosen her terms. Last came the Sterlings, their name familiar in every trading post from Cheyenne to Rawlins. Jennifer Sterling smiled at everyone she passed with a pleasant, practiced sweetness, though her eyes darted quickly, cataloging every detail like a merchant sorting inventory. It was unmistakably a parade of wealth, ambition, and quiet intentions. Each girl arrived with an invisible contract folded neatly behind her charm, an unspoken agreement tying land, power, and future to the Brennan name. And Clara watched it all from the far side of the corral. She stood with a bucket in hand, her braids slipping over her shoulder as she leaned against the fence. The silk dresses shimmered, the polished boots clicked on hard-packed earth. The girls laughed with a brightness that clashed with the simple, dusty rhythms of ranch life. Clara's clothes were plain, faded buckskin, a cotton blouse softened by years of wear, and boots that had seen more seasons than any of the visiting carriages. She didn't resent them. That wasn't her way. She watched with the steady, observant quiet of someone who knew the world had many different kinds of people, some born into soft dreams, others carved out of harsh lands. She simply understood that their world was not hers. But what she did not understand, what she could not understand, was why Thomas Brennan stood stiff as a fence post by the porch, yet couldn't keep his eyes from drifting toward the corral. Every time she moved, lifting a saddle, brushing a mare, adjusting a bridle, his gaze flickered her way. Just a fraction, barely noticeable to anyone else. Yet to Clara, it felt like a warm pulse of sunlight on a cold morning, subtle, invasive, impossible to ignore. She quickly busied herself with her work, hoping the distance between them was enough to keep trouble from sparking. Sarah Whitman noticed before anyone else. She had a way of watching people that came from years of dealing with rough ranch hands and harder winters. She saw beneath surfaces, beneath pretenses. While the other young women fluttered around Marcus like jeweled birds, Sarah's attention kept returning to Thomas, then to Clara, then back again. When she finally approached Thomas, she walked with the unhurried ease of someone who didn't need to impress a soul on earth. She joined him by the hitching post, standing shoulder to shoulder as if they'd known each other far longer than a 10-minute introduction. "You've changed since last spring," she said lightly, still watching the yard. Thomas stayed silent. Sarah followed his gaze toward the corral, where Clara bent to retrieve a brush that had fallen. Wind tugged at the hem of Clara's shirt, lifting the strands of her hair. Sarah exhaled, soft but sure. In the quiet, she said what he feared someone eventually would. "I know who you're looking at." Thomas swallowed hard, jaw tightening, but he didn't deny it. And Sarah, practical as the Wyoming soil, offered him a small wry smile, half understanding, half warning. "Just be careful," she murmured. "Love and land don't always ride in the same direction." But it was too late. Thomas knew it, Sarah knew it, and soon, everyone else would too. The storm hit the valley the way old ranchers always warned about, fast, unruly, and packed with the kind of Wyoming fury that could peel shingles off a roof and send dust swirling like a living thing. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and wind slammed against the Double B Ranch with a violent, unrelenting push. Doors rattled. Lantern flames guttered. The air itself seemed charged, restless, unpredictable. Thomas Brennan was halfway through latching the barn shutters when he heard the first panicked whinny. One of the younger geldings kicked at its stall, hooves striking wood. Then another horse joined in, and another. He cursed softly. Storms like this made animals remember every fear carved into their instincts. As he sprinted toward the main stable, he saw a blur running from the bunkhouse. Clara. Her braid whipped behind her like a dark banner, rain already soaking her shoulders. She didn't hesitate, didn't slow. She dove through the stable doors just as the wind howled hard enough to rip loose a section of the shingles overhead. Inside, chaos reigned. Horses reared, slamming against their stalls. Dust and hay churned in the air. The lantern light swayed wildly, throwing jagged shadows across the beams. Thomas rushed in after her, fighting against the gusts that forced the doors half shut behind him. "Take the left row," he yelled over the wind. Clara nodded, breath sharp, posture steady despite the trembling structure around them. She moved with a kind of practiced courage, sure-footed, nimble, instinctive. The horses responded to her calm presence, even in their terror. She stroked their necks, murmured in soft Apache, tightened halters, guided them back into place. Thomas grabbed the bridle of his father's prized stallion, the animal thrashing so hard the entire stall rattled. Clara appeared beside him, fingers brushing his as she reached to help. For a moment, their hands gripped the same leather strap. The same force, the same chaos. Thunder cracked outside. The horse jerked forward and Clara stumbled, falling into Thomas's chest. He caught her without thinking, one arm around her waist, the other stabilizing the stall door. They froze, breathing hard, rain beating on the roof, wind screaming through the gaps, heartbeat against heartbeat. Their faces hovered only inches apart. Close enough that Thomas could see the raindrops clinging to her lashes. Close enough that Clara could feel the heat rising off his skin, despite the cold air. "This place is coming apart," she said, voice shaky but steady enough. "So am I," he whispered before he could stop himself. The stallion reared again, snapping them back into motion. Together they wrestled the bridle into place, tightening straps, soothing the horse until it calmed enough to stand still. When it finally settled, Clara sagged against the stable wall, chest rising and falling in deep, quick breaths. Thomas stepped toward her, rain dripping from his hair onto the hay-strewn floor. "Clara," he said softly, as though saying her name too loud might break something fragile between them. She looked up, and something in him snapped loose. The storm outside roared like the whole world was trying to tear itself open. But inside the stable, something very different broke free. He reached out, pulling her against him, and she didn't pull away. Not immediately. Their lips met with a fierce, desperate urgency, a heat that had been growing for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer than either of them dared to admit. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a storm kiss, sharp, breathless, forbidden. The kind that came from two people who had run out of places to hide from the truth. Clara's hands rose to his chest, trembling. Thomas cupped the back of her neck, deepening the kiss, letting every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every aching thought crash into that single moment. But then, she broke away, abruptly. Her breath was ragged, eyes wide, almost stricken. She took a step back, then another, rainwater and sweat glistening on her skin under the lantern's wavering glow. "We can't," Clara whispered, voice cracking. "Thomas, we can't." He reached for her, but she turned her face aside. "We don't belong to the same world," she said, pain threading through her words like a tightly pulled rope. "Your family, your name, your life. It's not meant to cross with mine. Wind slammed the stable wall. Horses stirred, lanterns flickered. Thomas stood perfectly still, chest heaving, rain dripping from his jaw. That world means nothing without you, he said. But Clara shook her head, stepping farther back toward the shadowed stalls. Putting distance between them, even as her eyes glistened, was something that looked dangerously close to longing. This, she whispered, voice trembling like the storm-tossed roof overhead, should never have happened. Then she turned away, leaving Thomas standing in the half-dark, heart pounding like thunder, knowing with absolute certainty that nothing about this storm would be easy to survive. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the land washed clean and glittering under the pale Wyoming sun. But inside Thomas Brennan's chest, the chaos hadn't settled. Sleep never came after Clara walked away from him in the stable. He had paced his room until the first traces of morning light carved thin gold lines through the shutters, thinking about her, about his father, about the crushing weight of the Brennan legacy. By the time the rooster crowed its first sharp cry across the yard, Thomas already had a saddle packed and a purpose burning through him. The world wanted to close in on him from every direction. His father's schemes, the visiting families, the unspoken gossip weaving through ranch hands. But for the first time, he saw a path out. A sliver of possibility sharp enough to cut through years of expectation. The railroad. Men from the Harrison line had been hovering around nearby properties for months, scouting, bargaining, threatening, depending on how resistant a landowner felt. Their goal was simple: secure a clean route through the North Valley for the new Pacific Line, and Double B owned the stretch they wanted most. Marcus had dismissed every offer made so far, but Thomas saw something Marcus didn't. He saw leverage. He saw independence. He saw freedom, not for the ranch but for himself. If he could strike a deal that preserved the land and brought in a sum large enough to stabilize their finances, Marcus would lose the one excuse he kept brandishing: that Thomas must marry into wealth to protect the family empire. It was a long shot, a risky one, but it was more promising than the fate waiting for him at the end of a polished dining table surrounded by silk dresses and greedy parents. Before sunrise, Thomas guided his horse up the ridge, grit cold against his face as the wind cut through the morning chill. He traveled light and fast, not wanting a soul on the ranch to know where he was heading. 2 miles outside Elk Ridge, the temporary office of the Harrison line sat like a scar across the prairie. Canvas tents, iron stoves, piles of papers held down by stones. Smoke curled into the air above a mess of boots and metal tools scattered around the camp. These men lived rough, moved fast, and negotiated like wolves who smelled blood. Perfect. Thomas tethered his horse and walked straight toward the largest tent. Inside, Gregory Miles, lead representative of the Harrison line, looked up from a pile of ledgers, irritation forming sharp creases around his eyes. "You're the Brennan boy," he said, voice tight and calculating. "Didn't expect a visit from you." Thomas removed his hat, kept his shoulders squared. "We need to talk about the north property line." Miles leaned back, studying him with a predator's patience. "Your father's turned down every offer we've put on the table." "I'm not my father." The man's brows lifted, interest flickering like a struck match. They spent the next hour poring over maps, tracing ridge lines, discussing water access, grazing displacement, legal boundaries. Every point was a standoff, Miles pushing, Thomas pushing back. There were veiled threats about eminent domain, hints about alternative routes, not so subtle reminders that the railroad wouldn't wait forever. But Thomas refused to be intimidated. He had grown up in dust and storms. He knew all about pressure, and with every counter-argument he delivered, measured, calm, stubborn, the man across from him grew less smug and more intrigued. When Miles finally folded his arms, he studied Thomas with a new respect. "You're serious about this," the man said. Thomas nodded. "This deal saves my family from debts they won't admit we have, and it secures your cleanest route. You want the land. I want the freedom the money brings. But it has to be done my way." Miles drummed his fingers on the table. "Your father will fight this." "He'll try," Thomas admitted. "But he can't argue with numbers, and he can't accuse me of throwing away the ranch if I'm the one saving it." The railroad representative slid a neatly folded draft contract across the table. "This could work," he said, "if you can get your old man to sign." Thomas's jaw tightened. That would be the real battle, the storm he hadn't yet faced. He stepped outside, letting the cold wind sting his face while the sun climbed higher, turning the prairie gold. The deal wasn't final. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in months, maybe years, Thomas felt a door crack open. A door out of duty, out of obligation. A door toward a future where he could choose love over legacy, where he could choose Clara. But as the wind carried the faint scent of horses and dust from the distant ranch, he knew one thing for certain. Marcus Brennan would not see this as salvation. He would see it as betrayal. Rumors moved through the Double B Ranch the same way dust storms rolled across the Wyoming plains. Quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere, seeping into corners no one meant to leave open. It started with a single cowboy, a young hand named Reggie, who had gone to check the south fence line just as dawn settled its pale gold over the valley. On his way back, he spotted Thomas and Clara near the corral, standing too close, speaking too softly. The wind carried nothing of their words, but it didn't have to. Reggie saw enough to stitch together his own version of the story. By the time the breakfast bell rang, half the ranch hands had heard something. By midday, the other half had opinions about it. And by late afternoon, that whisper had grown sharp edges and traveled all the way to Marcus Brennan's ears. Marcus had lived his entire life managing not only cattle and land, but the people who worked it. And he knew the sound of a rumor that refused to die. When Thomas returned home from the railroad camp that evening, the air inside the ranch house felt too still, as if waiting for something inevitable. He didn't make it 3 steps through the door before the housekeeper told him, in a hushed, brittle tone, "Your father wants you in his office now." The hallway felt longer than usual, the walls heavier, the old wooden floorboards creaking under every step as though warning him to turn back. When he reached the office door, he barely had time to knock before Marcus's voice barked, "Get in." Thomas stepped inside. The door slammed behind him with a force that rattled the glass in the picture frames. Papers lay scattered across Marcus's desk. Maps, cattle reports, receipts, but none of it seemed to matter. Marcus stood with both hands braced against the windowsill, staring out at the distant pasture where the sky bled into dusk. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "I hear things I shouldn't be hearing about my own son." Thomas kept his voice steady. "If it's about Clara..." Marcus spun around so fast the room seemed to tilt. "A girl from the bunkhouse," he snapped. "An Apache girl? A girl with no family, no property, no future? You've embarrassed yourself. You've embarrassed me. You've embarrassed this ranch." Every word landed like a blow, but Thomas didn't flinch. "It's not what you think," he said quietly. "Oh, I know exactly what it is." Marcus jabbed a finger toward him. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. You're letting a stable girl pull you off your path, off the Brennan legacy, off everything I've built." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "She's not just a stable girl." "Then what is she?" Marcus roared. "What could she possibly be to a Brennan?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "I love her." Silence hit the room so hard it seemed to swallow the walls. Marcus stared at him, eyes wide, not in disbelief, but in something far colder. The kind of silence that felt like a canyon with no bottom, the kind that forced even the wind to hold its breath. 10 seconds passed, then another 5. Marcus didn't shout, didn't break anything, didn't pace. He simply stepped closer, his voice dropping into a deep, dangerous quiet. "You are my only son," he said. "The future of this ranch? And you're telling me you'd throw that away for a girl who has nothing?" "She has more strength and more loyalty than anyone you've ever brought into this house," Thomas said, meeting his father's eyes without wavering. "And she doesn't care about money or names or power. She cares about people. She cares about this land. She cares about me." Marcus's expression hardened, becoming something carved from old granite. "You think this is love? This is foolishness, a phase, something you'll regret in 10 years. "No," Thomas said. "I'll regret it if I walk away from her." Marcus exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, dry, humorless. "You are blinded, and I will not let your weakness ruin this family." "It's not weakness to choose love," Thomas replied. Marcus's hand slammed against the desk, rattling the ink bottle. "It is when it threatens everything we have." Thomas stepped forward, voice steady but burning with a quiet, rising defiance. "You don't get to decide who I give my heart to." Marcus stared at him as if seeing a stranger. "So that's how it is," he finally said. Thomas nodded once. "That's how it is." Outside, the wind picked up, scraping against the house like restless spirits. Somewhere on the ranch, a horse whinnied, as if sensing the fracture cutting clean through the Brennan family. Because in that office, behind that closed door, something had shifted, something that could no longer be undone. Marcus Brennan wasted no time after his confrontation with Thomas. By the next afternoon, the ranch house, normally a place of dust, boots, and practical business, had been transformed into something colder, stiffer, almost ceremonial. The great office doors stood open, revealing a room filled with polished boots, silk skirts, gold pocket watches, and expressions sharpened by ambition. The 5 wealthiest families in Wyoming had answered Marcus's summons quickly, each believing this meeting would finally settle the future of Double B Ranch. The parents stood in a half circle, hands folded, eyes calculating. Their daughter stood beside them, bright polished ornaments arranged as if for a silent inspection. Margaret Prescott wore her confidence like an expensive shawl. Sarah Whitman looked tense but composed. The others, Helen Carmichael, Lillian Harrison, and Grace Sterling, wore practiced social smiles, sweetened with expectancy. And in the far corner of the room, summoned but not welcomed, stood Clara. She did not shrink, did not bite her lip, did not wring her hands like Marcus might have expected. She stood with her back straight, her braid resting over one shoulder, her dark eyes calm as a mountain lake. A girl with nothing, and somehow everything, in her carriage. Marcus wanted her to feel small. Instead, she made the room feel too narrow for everyone else. Thomas entered last. His father didn't offer him a chair. "Let's begin," Marcus announced, voice clipped. "You all know why you're here. My son is ready to choose a wife. He will select the woman who best secures the future of Double B Ranch." The girls exchanged fleeting glances, masks of politeness slipping for a heartbeat. Thomas's jaw clenched. Marcus continued, "But before we make our decision, there is a matter that must be addressed." His gaze slid toward Clara, cold as Wyoming stone in winter. "This girl has become a distraction, and I will not allow rumors to damage what our families have built." Eyes turned toward her, curious, judgmental, pitying, irritated. Clara stayed still, breathing even. Margaret Prescott stepped forward first. She had inherited her father's sharp business acumen and his sharper tongue. "So this is the girl," she said lightly. "The ranch hand." Her lips curved into something polite but poisonous. "She's very plain, and she has nothing to offer. No dowry, no name, no influence. I don't mean offense. It's just the truth of her situation." Clara did not flinch. Her stillness unnerved Margaret more than any argument would have. "She doesn't belong in this room," Margaret added. "No?" Clara finally said, her voice soft but steady, smooth as river stones shaped by decades of current. "But I was brought here, and since I'm here, I'll speak." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Clara's eyes met Margaret's without hostility, only clarity. "You say I have nothing," she began, "and maybe in your world that is true. I have no money, no name to fill a ledger, no land to trade or bargain with." Her voice did not waver. "But I have lived through things that would break people who think strength comes from a bank vault. I know how to survive. I know how to work. I know how to be loyal. And I do not need to be chosen by any family here." The room fell into a taut silence. "I only want to live honest," Clara said, "and not be ashamed of who I am." For the first time that day, Sarah Whitman's gaze softened. Marcus's jaw tightened. Margaret scoffed, but something uncertain flickered behind her eyes. Irritation at being unable to rattle the girl she expected to shatter. Then Thomas stepped forward, and every set of eyes swung toward him. His voice when he spoke was low but unmistakably resolute. "This ends now." Marcus stiffened. "Thomas!" "No," Thomas said, cutting him off for the first time in his life. "I've been pushed and maneuvered and paraded around long enough. You called these families here because you thought you could force my hand." He looked at each girl in turn, kind, respectful, apologetic. Then his gaze shifted to Clara, and something in his entire posture softened. "I choose Clara," he said, "no one else." The words crashed through the office like a kicked-in saloon door. Margaret inhaled sharply. Grace Sterling whispered something into her mother's sleeve. A few fathers exchanged looks, a mix of annoyance and financial recalculation. Marcus's face drained of color. "That is not your decision to make," he hissed. Thomas stepped closer, voice firm and steady. "It is the only decision that's mine." Clara's breath hitched, though she kept her composure. The room had turned to a battlefield, quiet, elegant, but brutal in its judgment. She could feel the weight of every stare pressing on her like a stone on the chest. But Thomas's words cut through that pressure, like wind slicing open the prairie. He reached for her hand, not dramatically, not for show, but with the kind of sincerity that made even the harshest ranchers swallow hard. "I won't marry for land or power," he said. "I'll marry for love, and I love her." The room erupted at once, outrage, argument, disbelief. But it didn't matter, because the declaration had been made. And nothing on this ranch, no storm, no rumor, no family alliance, would ever be the same again. The aftermath of Thomas's declaration didn't crash over the ranch like a single thunderclap. It rolled through it in heavy, relentless waves, the kind that made even seasoned ranch hands pause mid-stride and look toward the house, sensing something had shifted in the bones of the Double B. The air felt taut, unsettled, like the long silence before a prairie storm decides whether it will break the land or bless it with rain. Marcus Brennan remained standing in the middle of his office long after the visiting families had filed out. Some affronted, some whispering, some simply disappointed their long-crafted ambitions had fallen apart in one sentence. Their boots thudded down the porch steps and scattered into carriages and wagons, leaving the ranch unusually quiet for so many people having just been there. Only Thomas, Clara, and Marcus stayed behind. Thomas stood beside Clara in a protective, almost instinctive way, one hand lightly near hers, close but not touching, as if he feared one wrong movement might send her retreating into the shadows again. Clara, for her part, looked calm, not fearless. No one faced a patriarch like Marcus without some tremor in the chest, but steady, soft steel wrapped in warmth. The kind of courage born not from defiance, but from surviving things far harsher than insults in a well-furnished office. Marcus didn't look at either of them at first. He stared at the map of the ranch pinned on the wall. Rivers, boundary lines, pasture divisions. Everything he'd spent a lifetime building, protecting, expanding. Everything he planned to secure for his son and the next Brennan generation. But Thomas had just set the entire vision ablaze with one truth. "I choose Clara, no one else." Marcus finally turned around. The deep lines on his weathered face seemed carved deeper than usual, as if years had been added in minutes. Pride and disappointment warred openly in his eyes. Anger simmered beneath the surface. But so did something older, heavier, more human. His voice, when it came, was rough. "Do you understand what you're asking me to accept?" Thomas straightened. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you who I am and who I love." Marcus's jaw tightened, as if bracing for a blow. Before he could speak, footsteps approached softly from the hallway. Sarah Whitman stepped forward. She hadn't left with the others. She had lingered at the door, watching, waiting, measuring the mood like someone who knew when a fire could be smothered and when it needed air. She wasn't dressed like the other girls in lace or ruffles. She wore a traveling skirt and riding boots, dust still clinging to the hem, and her expression held neither spite nor wounded pride, just frankness. "Mr. Brennan," she said, addressing Marcus with a calm that gently cut through the tension in the room, "if he loves her, fighting this will only make all of you miserable." Marcus glared at her. "You think this is simple?" "I think it's honest," Sarah replied, "and that counts for something out here." Her eyes flicked briefly to Clara, not with jealousy nor pity, but with recognition. "You're not losing a son," she told Marcus. "You're gaining someone who's willing to stand beside him for the right reasons." The room held its breath. Marcus looked at Thomas again. Really looked at him. Not as the heir he'd shaped for decades, but as a man standing at the crossroads between duty and desire. For the first time, Marcus saw the truth he'd tried so hard not to see. Thomas wasn't a boy waiting to be molded. He was a grown man choosing his own life. Marcus let out a long, slow exhale, the kind that carried years of stubborn fear wrapped in pride. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in reluctant acceptance. "You're my son," he said quietly. "My only son." Thomas swallowed, throat tightening. "I know. I built this ranch for you, for your future, for the Brennan name." Marcus's voice strained. "And you'd really stake all of that on her?" Clara stepped forward, not too close, but close enough that her presence felt steady, grounded. "I don't want anything from your ranch," she said gently, "or your land, or your name. I only want the chance to live honestly, beside him, if he chooses it." Thomas felt his chest pull tight at her words. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, perhaps seeing the young man Thomas used to be, or the future he had planned, or the truth settling in despite every instinct he had to resist it. When he opened them, something had softened, even if only slightly. "I won't give you my blessing," Marcus said at last, voice gravelly. "Not today, maybe not ever." Thomas's heart sank, but Marcus wasn't finished. "But," Marcus stepped closer, the room growing still, "I also won't destroy your life to force you into mine." Clara exhaled shakily. Thomas's shoulders eased. It wasn't approval, but it was surrender, a kind that shook the Brennan family more deeply than any argument could. Marcus turned away, gripping the edge of his desk as though steadying himself. "Get out of here," he muttered, voice low. "Both of you, before I change my mind." Thomas took Clara's hand, this time openly, undeniably, and led her out of the office, down the hallway, past the portraits of ancestors who demanded legacy more than love. Behind them, Marcus remained alone in the dim office, staring at the land that had defined him, and wondering if letting go of his grip was the only way to keep his son. The Brennan Empire had not fallen, but it had cracked. And cracks, if handled right, sometimes let the light in. The weeks that followed Marcus Brennan's reluctant surrender moved through the Double B Ranch like the slow, steady melt of winter snow, quiet, transformative, and impossible to stop. Life didn't return to normal. It shifted into something new, something uncertain and yet strangely hopeful. And at the center of it all were Clara and Thomas, trying to build a life no one had expected, least of all the two of them. Clara never once tried to play the part of a proper bride by the Valley's social standards. She didn't suddenly trade her work boots for satin slippers or her braided hair for perfect curls. She remained herself, fierce, gentle, grounded. But she did want to be capable of running a home, of tending to guests, of helping Thomas manage a ranch that stretched farther than the eye could see. So the women of Elk Ridge, gritty, seasoned, sharp-tongued but soft-hearted, took it upon themselves to teach her. Mrs. Dobbs showed her how to stitch seams strong enough to outlast Wyoming wind. Clara pricked her fingers a dozen times, laughed it off, and kept sewing until her lines straightened. Nora Bell taught her to cook biscuits that didn't turn into rocks. Clara burned the first batch, then the second, but by the third, Thomas swore he'd never tasted anything better. She blushed, swatted his arm, and made another tray just to prove she could. Even the widowed Mrs. Finch taught her ledger keeping, how to track feed, wages, and barn expenses. "Running a household is like running a small kingdom," she told Clara. "You do it with grit, not lace." Clara learned everything with patience and determination, never out of obligation, never to impress Marcus or the townsfolk. She simply wanted to step into this new chapter with competence, not permission. And in every lesson, every shared laugh, she felt something she'd rarely felt since losing her family, a sense of belonging. While Clara learned, Thomas worked. The railroad money arrived like a long-awaited rain on a parched field. Not wealth beyond measure, but stability. Enough to pay old debts, repair broken fences, and keep the ranch from leaning on marriage alliances like a crutch. With financial freedom in hand, Thomas began reshaping the Double B into something closer to the place he envisioned as a boy. He reopened abandoned parcels of land that Marcus had deemed unprofitable decades earlier and turned them into homesteads for local families who had been scraping by. Widowers, traveling laborers, single mothers, people the valley had overlooked, were offered leases at prices so low, some cried right there on the porch while shaking Thomas's hand. It made Marcus furious at first. Too generous, too idealistic. But even he couldn't deny the sight of children running through fields that once sat lifeless, of new fences going up, of smoke rising from chimneys once cold. The ranch felt alive again, not just prosperous. Thomas didn't say it aloud, but Clara was the quiet reason behind every decision. He wanted a world she could step into without shame, a future she could breathe in, a ranch built on decency, not dominance. Each morning, just after the sunrise set the valley glowing with soft amber, Clara saddled her favorite mare and rode along the creek cutting through the north pasture. The horse loved the cool rush of water and the scent of wild sage drifting on the early breeze. She didn't ride alone. Thomas always came with her, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes silently at her side. He said it was to keep an eye on the livestock, but anyone who saw the way he watched Clara knew better. He was memorizing her smile when she leaned down to touch the water, memorizing the way her braids swung behind her as the horse trotted, memorizing the gentle courage in her eyes whenever she turned toward him. Their conversations weren't always romantic. Sometimes they talked about fence repairs or a sick mare, or how many calves were expected that spring. But it was in those quiet, ordinary moments, when their horses walked side by side and the wind brushed against their shoulders, that their love rooted itself deeper. One morning, Clara slowed her horse beside his and said softly, "I never imagined a life like this." Thomas nudged his hat back, looking at her with a warmth that melted the morning chill. "Neither did I." The world wasn't gentle yet. Rumors still whispered. Doubt still lingered. The future still felt fragile. But for the first time, they were building something real together. A home, a partnership, a love strong enough to weather Wyoming storms. And in those 2 months, Clara began to feel that maybe, just maybe, this wild, wind-carved land was offering her a new family after all. The wedding day dawned with one of those Wyoming mornings that felt almost unreal. Air crisp as bitten apples, sky wide enough to swallow whole dreams, and sunlight spilling over the valley like warm honey. The creek ran clear and bright, weaving silver ribbons through the grass. Cottonwood leaves shimmered, whispering in the breeze as if they already knew what was coming. Clara stood near the water's edge, hands smoothing the front of her dress. Not out of nervousness, but wonder. Her wedding dress wasn't silk or lace. It was Apache made, sewn from soft earth-toned fabric, hand-embroidered with patterns her mother once taught her to sketch in the dirt. Every stitch held meaning, family, resilience, the path walked and the path still ahead. Her hair, long and braided, was threaded with small turquoise stones, and feathers gifted by the women who had taught her, guided her, accepted her. She looked like she belonged to the land itself, rooted, graceful, strong. When she turned and saw Thomas waiting for her across the clearing, her breath caught. Thomas wore a deep brown leather vest, clean white shirt, dark trousers, and his father's old pocket watch tucked into his belt. He looked like a man who had finally found where he wanted to stand in life, and more importantly, who he wanted to stand beside. The ranch hands, the townsfolk, the families who had once eyed her with distance, all gathered in a loose half-circle around the makeshift altar made from 2 joined fence posts. Horses snorted softly from where they were tied nearby, their ears flicking with curiosity. Even the land seemed to pause. As Clara walked toward Thomas, the crowd shifted, the rustle of boots and skirts blending with the wind. No music played, none was needed. The sound of Wyoming itself became the wedding march. River, wind, grass, sky. Marcus Brennan stood near the back. Not hidden, but not close either. His arms were folded, expression unreadable. Yet the bitterness that once tightened his shoulders had loosened. His eyes, tired, stubborn, human, softened when Clara passed him. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, but he didn't turn away. For Thomas, that was enough. Judge Thornton, gruff as a weathered saddle but with a heart rumored to be softer than his voice suggested, cleared his throat when the couple reached the altar. "We're gathered here under God's sky and on the good earth of the Double B Ranch," he said. 2 people choosing each other freely. That's a rare thing in this world, rarer still in Wyoming. So we honor it today. Clara and Thomas faced each other. He took her hands, calloused from years of work but warm, steady, familiar now. She felt the strength in his grip, the sincerity in his eyes, the promise unspoken but alive in every breath. Judge Thornton nodded. "Say your vows." Thomas's voice was quiet, but it carried. "Clara, I promise to stand with you when storms come, when seasons change, when life turns hard or gentle. You're my home, you're my partner, and I'll spend every day proving you chose right." Clara's eyes shimmered. She lifted her chin slightly and spoke with a clarity forged in pain and rebuilt in hope. "Thomas, I choose you, not for your name or your land or your future, but because you see me, and you love me without asking me to be someone else. I'll walk beside you, build beside you, and be your strength when you falter. This is my vow." Judge Thornton smiled beneath his mustache. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Wyoming, and by the approval of everyone standing here, whether they voiced it or not, I pronounce you husband and wife." Thomas leaned in, kissed her gently, reverently, like a prayer answered. The crowd erupted into cheers, hats tossed in the air, hands clapping, horses stamping in excitement. Even Marcus shifted, just a little, his chin lifting in what might one day be recognized as pride. The wind swept through the clearing right then, soft but certain, swirling around the couple as if the land itself offered its blessing. Clara, once the orphaned Apache girl who survived loss, exile, and silence, now stood with a husband who chose her openly, a community learning to accept her, and a future she had shaped with her own hands. Under the vast Wyoming sky, she finally felt something she had believed she'd never feel again. Home.